Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, clients, stakeholders, my fellow partners and colleagues present in person. It's really great to see people in the room, and welcome to those that are tuning in on the live stream event through YouTube. My name is Ramsey MacDonald. I'm the managing partner of Deloitte in Namibia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Deloitte and Cirrus Budget Breakfast Analysis event. This is the first in-person event that Deloitte is hosting in Namibia since the 13th of March 2020. I'm sure you all remember that date. This is when the world reached into Namibia and changed our way of life in a very short period of time. If one of your coping mechanisms was to wash away your worries with your favorite tipple, well, as you would already have felt, it's probably a more expensive coping mechanism than a few days ago. As we now start or continue our journey back to some sense of normality by boosting resilience and recovery in 2021, the year of resilience, we look forward to getting back to things we may have forgotten about. It's really great to be speaking to people in the room and not only looking at images on a computer screen. No offense to those that are streaming live. We wish you could all be here this morning, but maybe next year. The Honourable Minister in his second budget speech might be wondering about the hospital pass that he received of being appointed Minister of Finance in some of the most difficult days that a country can imagine. How do you balance these immediate life and livelihood priorities with restarting the economy? Quite rightly, availability of and access to the vaccine in Namibia is an important part of that plan of recovery. The Honourable Minister has adopted a different approach to engagement post the budget speech and will unfortunately not be joining us either online or in person this morning. But we do look forward to engaging with him in the near future once we've had time to assimilate the budget. I'm sure our guest speakers this morning will provide you with the insights and an initial valuation of the budget speech and their proposals after their all-night studying of the budget speech. Because we need to comply with COVID regulations for our own safety and the safety of those and well-being of others in the room, I do need to spend some of my time this morning to talk about the golden rules and basic logistic arrangements. As mentioned, the session is being streamed live on YouTube. COVID compliance is important for those of us in the room. Please wear your masks at all times, except obviously when you're eating. You might find it difficult. Ensure that you keep your 1.5 meter social distancing, and the event will be completed within the 2-hour time.
Thank you, Ramsey, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take you through the background, the macroeconomic background on the budget and some of the key things that we picked up on from the Minister's speech. We've titled our section on this, the Rubicon budget, and I think the reason for that will become quite clear as we go forward, and if you read history and the story of Caesar and his attempts to cross the Rubicon. The presentation will be broken down into 5 sections. Firstly, an economic overview that gives some general background with regards to the economic situation in the country that has resulted in the budget that we see now. Then moving on to the revenue side of the budget, thereafter expenditure, then debt, deficit and guarantees, i.e. the net effect of revenue and expenditure, and then some final thoughts from our side that we've put together with regards to this budget. Now, I think it's very important that we bear in mind where we start when it comes to this budget. And we actually wrote in October 2019, before COVID was a thing on the global scene, we wrote that this little piece from Ernest Hemingway in one of our reports. And we quoted and said, how do you go bankrupt? Which is a famous question that Hemingway was once asked. And he responded 2 ways, first gradually and then suddenly. And we think that there's a big risk that Namibia has reached this suddenly part, and we'll go through why we say that in the process of this presentation. With regards to the economic backdrop, and we really want to talk about this because it has a big bearing on this budget and on both the revenue side of the budget and expenditure. But basically what you can see from this chart is that over the past 5 years, we've had very, very low growth in the country. And on average now, with this big contraction that we've seen in 2020, we've had negative growth. This is the first time in Namibia's history that we've had this extended period of negative growth, but the implications of it are very severe. Less economic activity in the country obviously comes through into government's ability to collect revenue. But at the same time, this very low level of growth has huge impacts on where government needs to spend its money as well. Now, we've been told a number of times that the reason for this relatively low growth is external factors, but we don't believe that this is true. And the reason that we say this is you can see on this chart that Namibia was a very high growth economy, one of the fastest growing economies in the world between 2010 and 2015. However, from 2015, Namibia's growth ranking has fallen off a cliff. Namibia is a small and a young developing economy, and it should have relatively high degrees of growth because of that. We have what we call a demographic dividend, which means we have a large number of young people, which means a relatively large labor force as a percent of the total population. And that should mean that we feature in the top at least third of economies in the world from a growth perspective. However, going into 2019, we were the 16th slowest growing economy in the world. And this is a serious warning that the challenges that we face are not external challenges, but they are domestic challenges. The reason that we saw this enormous growth slowdown was really twofold. First and foremost, we saw a huge reduction in government expenditure in inflation-adjusted terms, the blue line on the chart here. The black line is not inflation-adjusted expenditure, and that's been flatlining since 2016, more or less. However, in inflation-adjusted terms, what you could buy with the approximate 65 billion that government has been spending per year since 2016 has reduced. And because government is such a big part of the economy, this contraction with regards to real expenditure does have an impact on the overall economy. More than this, however, in order to keep spending at the levels that we've seen over the last few years, government has had to borrow very aggressively. And we can see in both of these charts, firstly, the deficit, i.e. the amount of money as a percent of GDP that government is borrowing every year. And secondly, the implication of this with regards to the debt levels of the country. And then at the same time, the second factor that caused this big growth slowdown was a retreating of investment into the country and investment in the country. And this is a major concern going forward because investment is a leading indicator for economic activity. If you don't have investment into fixed capital assets today, like mines, manufacturing outlets, and similar, the chances of there being more jobs created tomorrow, more revenue for government tomorrow, etc., declines precipitously. And this was all before COVID. Then COVID came along and just worsened what was already a very negative trajectory. What we can see here is that there were three kind of types of shocks that the economy experienced as a result of COVID. The first is an external demand shock, and we've just got one slide to illustrate what this means. But in essence, it means that people were unable to purchase or unwilling to purchase Namibia's exported goods or services. And we can see this particularly clearly in the tourism line, in the tourism indicators, which went from relatively normal in January and February last year to virtually zero by March. The second type of shock was an internal supply shock. This, in essence, was a shock that came about as a result of the various health measures that were introduced to try to combat COVID. What this meant, however, was that people were not able to go to their places of work. And as a result of that, these places of work were not able to produce the goods or services that they usually do, at least to the extent that they usually do. And one example of this is beverage production, and you can see how beverage production fell dramatically during the lockdown last year. The third type of shock is an internal demand shock. This is the type of shock that occurs as a result of Namibian households having less money as a result of these other two shocks mentioned, and therefore being able to spend less in the shops in the country, and that reverberating through into things like employment levels in the shops and similar. And this was very much fuel on an already burning fire. We, going into COVID, had very high levels of household debt already. Relative to household incomes. And then household debt levels increased while household incomes fell, meaning that households had very little additional income to spend. And the implication of this was a roughly, we estimate, 15% reduction in consumption activity in the country. And you can see the impact of that if you go to shopping malls and similar around Namibia, and huge vacancies in the shops. And you need only imagine the people that worked in those shops previously who no longer have incomes and their ability to continue to spend and similar, and the impact that that has on the broader macroeconomy. Now, all of this was because of this COVID shock. And one of the things that we said relatively early on in this, actually in March last year already, was that we need to just make sure that our response is proportionate to the risk. And if we look at this chart, you can see the two red bars are firstly COVID deaths as of January this year when we produced this chart, and secondly, our expectation of March to March 2010 to 2011, the larger red bar. And we were pretty much spot on with regards to these forecasts. What this tells you, however, is that COVID is roughly as deadly as brain trauma and as lung diseases. Now, these are obviously very serious things, and these are not things that anyone would dismiss as non-issues. However, at the same time, one should be very cautious when it comes to having a huge impact on livelihoods at a broad scale because of these types of diseases, which are relatively small in terms of their morbidity risks and similar. Now, Namibia's initial response to the virus was probably quite understandable, going into relatively hard lockdown with relatively few cases, because we didn't know that much about the virus at that point in time. And rather than taking a risk, particularly where we have a high HIV positive, HIV AIDS prevalence in the country, and we weren't sure what the comorbidity risk would be like, rather than taking a risk on that, we took a precautious approach and did incur these relatively hard lockdowns. But as soon as it was clear that COVID was not that dangerous, we eased up, and the rhetoric changed from purely focused on lives to a focus on lives and livelihoods, and that was exactly the right thing to be doing. And we actually think as a result of that, Namibia's response to COVID was amongst the better responses in the world. However, it does leave us with a very difficult situation. On a GDP per capita basis, Namibia's levels are now well below the 2012 levels of per capita wealth in the country, or per capita value addition in the country, rather. And to get back to where we were in 2015 will require 4% growth compounded over a 10-year period because of the fact that we have had this big reduction in gross domestic product, and also because we have a continuously growing population. And this presents a very large challenge for the country. At the same time, we sit with unsustainably high levels of unemployment, and this is really where much of the macroeconomic analysis comes down to the impact on livelihoods, on households, and on people. And these very high levels of unemployment are not sustainable over the long term, and we need to look at ways in which we can bring these down. But we do sit with a difficult situation from a fiscal perspective in order to be able to do this. So moving on to the speech itself, looking very briefly at the backdrop and the key points and priorities, the Minister recognized that we sit with heightened deficit pressure, meaning that we have to borrow a lot of money, and a lot more money than we previously thought we would have to borrow. And we are running very large deficits as a result. Also, we've gone through this extended period of economic weakness, and we shouldn't look at ways to recover from this exclusively focused on COVID, but rather we need to look at some of the structural issues that existed before COVID if we want to see any meaningful long-term recovery. The economy is a lot smaller than it was in 2012 on a per capita basis, and unemployment levels, particularly youth unemployment, are very high, and this needs to be focused on going forward. But at the same time that we have these problems, we sit with big challenges around revenue generation, domestic revenue generation, as you'd expect with a shrinking and relatively small economy, but now also external revenue generation from the Southern African customs pool, and I'll talk to this a little bit more in a minute. So all of this means that a rebound in economic activity and a rebound in the fiscal situation of Namibia is very unlikely in the near term, and this is something that we have to be realistic about. We'll talk through revenue quickly before discussing expenditure. From a revenue perspective, the pink line on the chart here shows a remarkable reduction in revenue expectations from the previous forecasts that were done just roughly 6 months ago. And now we're expecting 52 odd billion worth of revenue to be generated this year, compared to 55 billion that was the previous expectation, and down from 55 billion in the previous year. But what's most concerning about this is that this low revenue expectation carries forward for the 2 years after the upcoming financial year as well. So for the full 3-year period, the forecast is for materially lower revenue than was previously expected. If you look at the various different sources of revenue, there hasn't been a major change with regards to expectations from the previous forecasts for income tax on individuals, company tax, and VAT. But there has been a huge reduction in expectations from the Southern African's customs pool. And this is typically about a third of Namibia's total revenue, and sometimes even more than that. So a big reduction in a big revenue line means a lot for the bottom line in terms of how much revenue we're going to be generating. SACU matters for 2 reasons. The first reason is because it's a very important source of revenue for government in order for government to be able to do the things that it wishes to do through the expenditure side of the budget. But it's also extremely important because it's a source of hard currency for the country, and Rand is considered hard currency by our central bank. Without this inflow of hard currency, it puts pressure on both government's ability to meet its expenditure targets without borrowing extensively, but it also puts pressure on our external position, meaning our hard currency reserves. And all other things being equal, we're estimating now a 12 to 14 billion reduction in reserve levels over the next 2 or 3 years, as I said, all things being equal. And that is something that we should all be very worried about, because the reserve levels matter if we wish to maintain a currency peg with the South African Rand long term. Moving on to the expenditure side of the budget, last year we saw an uptick, or in the current financial year that's just coming to an end, we saw an uptick in government expenditure from about 67 billion to roughly 72 billion. And the reason for this was because of the additional COVID expenditure requirements, things like the emergency income grants and some of the other policy response measures to COVID, and also health spending and similar, where additional expenditure was required because of this global pandemic. Going forward, we're expecting a roughly 5.6% or 5.7% reduction in government expenditure next year, or in the upcoming financial year. And this will be somewhat contractionary to the local economy. The reason for this, as mentioned previously, is that government is a very big portion of the economy. And so a reduction from 72 billion to 68 billion will have an impact, and we will see it coming through going forward. If we look at an expenditure breakdown, we've got operational expenditure, interest expenditure, and development expenditure. And you can see the reddish bars, the deep red bars here, are interest expenditure. And the only point that I really want to make on this slide is that we now sit with a situation where we're spending far more money on interest servicing than we are on development activities. And this is something that we should be concerned about. Looking at the operational expenditure line, which is the single biggest portion of total government expenditure, this can be stratified into various different things, but the main expenditure line in this is personnel expenditure. Because we've seen a reduction in revenue, the percent of revenue that's going to personnel, which is not changing, has increased dramatically, and we're now spending just under 55% of our total expenditure on wages and salaries and similar for civil service employees. And this is a highly, highly unsustainable situation. If we look by specific activities, the largest recipients of funds are education, finance, health, and social services. But interest payments make up the third largest expenditure line there. So we are spending more servicing our debt stock now than we are on health and social services, even during a time of global pandemic. And you can see in the pink bars here that over the next 3 years, the expectation is that revenue, the expenditure on interest payments will be over 15% of revenue in every single year. And 15% of revenue is the rough thumbsuck that the IMF applies for a potential debt trap situation. So Namibia is becoming our situation is becoming very precarious from a debt sustainability perspective. Because we are collecting roughly 52 billion in revenue and spending 68 billion on the expenditure side, we are running very large budget deficits. And that can be seen in the chart here, the section circled with that pink circle. What you can see there is that going back to 2010, we've had deficits where the blue line is above the black line in every year except one. However, going forward, the expectation is that these deficits will be larger than has been the case before, meaning that we need to borrow more than we did before. If you look at what's happened previously, the expectation has always been that we will see reductions in budget deficits in the outer years of the forecast periods, and that is still true today. However, that hasn't really materialized in the past, and we are cautious as to whether it will materialize going forward. But the bottom line here is that there's a very large amount of money to be borrowed should government wish to proceed with its expenditure plan as per this budget. And the quantum of this, I think, needs to be put into perspective. For the first time ever in the upcoming fiscal year, the single largest source of funding of expenditure will be borrowings, whereas historically it has always been one or other line of tax, usually SACU or personal income tax. Now, the single biggest source of funding for expenditure will be borrowing. And if you look at the chart on, I guess, your left here, you see the pink dotted line. That is the assumption of the borrowing requirement for the upcoming year split over a 12-month period. And you can see that that line is well above any historic year, including the COVID year that has just passed, the 2020-2021 year. And so this year we will be borrowing materially more from the domestic economy than we did even during the COVID year. And this tells you of a material structural challenge that the country is facing. And just looking at the net debt issuance that's required in Namibia over the next few years, we're sitting on amounts of 20 billion in the immediate year, then over 15 billion in the subsequent year, and then over 10 billion in the final year. And the big question is, where is this money going to come from? There simply is not this quantum of liquidity available in the domestic market looking for a home. And so the question is, so from where will it come? In all likelihood, Namibian pension funds are going to be lent on heavily in order to provide funding to government for these big budget deficits. The problem is that this has already happened in the past to fund many of the previous budget deficits, and the pension funds are becoming quite exposed to this government debt. At the same time, government's creditworthiness has been deteriorating as adjudicated by global rating agencies and similar. So more and more pension fund money is becoming exposed to a less and less creditworthy institution, the Namibian sovereign. And this is something that I think we should all be somewhat concerned about. Going forward, if we look at the size of the borrowing that's required, netting off coupon payments, which we assume will be reinvested in government debt, over the next few years, we're looking at something in the region of 15% of the pension funds of assets, pension fund assets that we expect will have to be invested in government debt, should government not find other sources of funding, i.e. foreign money coming into the domestic debt market or similar. And this is something that we need to be very cautious of because it can prejudice the owners of these pension fund assets over the long term. And as we like to say, these are not ownerless assets. These are the assets of pension fund members who have a very specific reason to be saving, which is that they have sufficient resources for their retirement. The debt stock going forward is somewhat worrying, and I think we can actually skip this slide and look at this, which gives a nice graphic representation of the growth in the debt stock over the past decade or so. So between 1990 and 2010, Namibia racked up a total of 12.97 billion worth of debt. So over this 20-year period, we racked up 12.9 billion, or roughly 13 billion worth of debt. 1 year thereafter, the debt levels had roughly doubled to nearly 24 billion. 4 years after that, more than doubled again to 56 billion. And by December 2020, it had doubled again to over 100 billion worth of debt. So in the first 3 decades of post-independence, we had 13 odd billion. We now, at the end of 2020, have roughly 106 billion worth of debt. Over the forecast period, so basically another 3 years out from where we are now, so 4 years out from where we are now, we expect there to be a total of 160 odd billion worth of government debt outstanding. And once again, the big question is who will be providing this debt and who is sitting on the risk of the maturity of this. At the same time, as mentioned, from 2010 onwards, we had a big increase in the country's debt stock. And much of that debt was utilized or was borrowed on 10-year tenor, meaning that it matured 10 years after it was first issued. So now we sit with big budget deficits, big borrowing requirements, but we also have a lot of the maturities from debt that was borrowed 10 years ago starting to come due, and the time has come in some ways to pay the piper. The big question 10 years ago, when this debt was first issued, was, is there going to be a counter entry on the balance sheet of government against this debt of an income-generating asset that was going to make it easier to service this debt over time? And we're not entirely sure that we can answer that question in the affirmative. And the big concern going forward is how will this debt be redeemed or rolled, and at what cost? As I mentioned, we do sit with a sub-investment grade rating for the country at the moment. And both of the rating agencies that cover Namibia, Fitch and Moody's, have Namibia in a sub-investment grade position, as has been the case now for quite a number of years. And this means that rolling this debt forward may be relatively expensive, relatively risky, or that we may require coercion of pension funds and similar to deploy assets into what is not a hugely investment or credit-worthy institution. Or it is a credit-worthy institution, but a less credit-worthy institution than was the case previously. And we believe that this is a deeply unsustainable situation. And we say this for many different reasons. First and foremost, 52 billion worth of revenue simply doesn't match up with 68 billion worth of expenditure. This differential is just far too large, and it's not sustainable over the long term, even when the forecast is for it to shrink with time. One cannot run deficits in the region of 10% of GDP over the long term. However, at the same time, there isn't really a good solution that involves cutting expenditure. We've already seen the impact of an austerity cycle on Namibia because of the fact that with the big growth in debt that we saw in 2015, there was little choice but to control expenditure in order to try to reduce the budget deficits. And had we not done that, the situation would be a lot worse now. So on the expenditure side, we don't think that big expenditure cuts are going to be very useful. We do think that a lot more can be done to improve the quality of expenditure. So if we're spending 68 billion, the question has to be, are we deploying this in its best possible manner to improve the lives of Namibians as best we can? Meaning, are we putting more people into houses? Are we getting more kids through school with world-class education? And are we ensuring that the population has access to world-class healthcare, amongst others? And I think that much more can be done there in order to improve the quality of expenditure and move money away from operational once-off expenditure towards higher quality development, high impact expenditure. But less expenditure is unlikely to be very useful at the current point in time. And that basically leaves us with a problem on the revenue side of the budget. Namibia has one of the highest tax revenue to GDP ratios in the world, meaning that our government is already getting a very good amount out of the current economic base. And trying to increase that, we believe, will in all likelihood be positively counterproductive. We don't think that a lot more can be extracted from this economic base without causing people to up and leave and businesses to close their doors, have fewer people employed, etc. The only real solution is a solution that revolves around growth and having a bigger economic base from which government can extract revenue, and there, through such a mechanism, close the gap between revenue and expenditure. However, we're not seeing the signs that we need for growth. There's only 4 components of GDP, as we like to regularly say. Households are largely tapped out with rising levels of unemployment, very high levels of debt, and low household income growth. And that's not going to change over the medium term or the near term because we're not seeing a lot of additional employment being created. Government expenditure, we've gone through in detail, and we don't see much scope for growth in that line because of the fact that government is already borrowing extensively in order to keep expenditure at the levels that it's at. Net exports is the third component of GDP, and net exports responds to other things. It doesn't really just happen in and of itself. And the final component of GDP is investment, and investment is the component that can drive growth, can drive household income recovery, can drive revenue recovery for government, and can drive an increase in exports or a reduction in imports, therefore an improvement in net exports. However, we're not seeing investment at the current point in time. And despite the fact that this is the most critical catalyst for growth in the economy and recovery in the fiscal position, we're actually seeing an outflow of capital from the economy, not the inflow of capital that we need in order to drive growth. As well as that, the capital that is in the country is not being deployed into fixed capital assets in the manner that it needs to be, i.e. we're not seeing investment into new mines, manufacturing facilities, etc., etc. And because of that, And because that's a leading indicator, we don't see this realistic expectation that there's going to be a material upswing in high-quality employment and an improvement in household wages and incomes going forward. And this is a material concern for the country. Now, the reason that we're not seeing investment is one that's disputed a lot. And we were told, and we've been told many times, that there's many opinions as to why this is, which is completely true. Most of those opinions, however, are wrong. The real reason that there is not the investment coming into the country that we need in order to drive growth is twofold. Firstly, it's become a more difficult jurisdiction in which to eke out a return, one of the reasons that investors invest. And secondly, it's become a materially more risky environment in which to invest. From a return perspective, a shrinking economy in and of itself contributes to a deterioration in return prospects. And the fact that we have got this negative spiral now is one of the reasons that we're not seeing a strong investment recovery. And we need to turn that corner before we're likely to have a high growth environment that will continuously attract investment and go from a vicious cycle of investment withdrawal to a virtuous cycle of incoming investment and growth. As well as that, from a return perspective, the costs are being layered on businesses from excess bureaucracy and bureaucracy being inefficiently implemented. And this really ramped up through the COVID year for understandable reasons, but it really illustrated the fact that we have too many rules relatively poorly implemented in the country, making it difficult for businesses to make decisions, to move forward, to invest and similar. And now, in the recent budget, we see talk of further tax changes. This is a bit of a double-edged sword because the minister mentioned on the one hand that he's considering reducing the non-mining corporate tax, which is something that we've been in favor of for a number of years. However, there's no clarity given by what amount, in what manner, etc. On the other side, there's talk of taxing dividends, which is the income flow that investors receive from the investments in businesses. If the 10% tax on dividends that is proposed is not met with a substantial reduction in corporate tax, the net effect for investors will be negative. And the implication of this is that fewer people will come and invest in the country, and some of the current investors will likely decide that they've had enough and that the return that they're able to generate simply doesn't make sense for the amount of effort and risk that they're taking, the effort that they're undertaking and the risk that they're taking. From a risk perspective, the situation has also changed dramatically, and this is one of the major factors that's driving a withdrawal of investment from the country. Firstly, we have an increasingly uncertain policy environment. And one thing that we would like to caution about here is uncertainty around policy is just as damaging as bad policy. But one shouldn't think that removing uncertainty will mean that investment returns per se. The event where you have policy that makes it difficult to generate a return is just as damaging as uncertainty as to whether there's policy that will cause you to not be able to make a return. So should we push through bad policies that make it impossible or difficult for businesses to create a return, we shouldn't think that that will suddenly mean that the reduction of uncertainty has driven investment or will drive investment. The second consideration here is a consideration around property rights. People often think when we talk about property rights that we mean physical property, land, housing, etc. But property rights goes far further than that. It's the cash in someone's wallet. And the critical question around property rights is, will the organ of the state protect the property of investors should they bring that property into the country? And should somebody try to have it off their hands, will those organs of the state adequately return it to them? We see an increasingly concerning situation here whereby the organs of the state are considering whether they shouldn't allow the expropriation of third parties' property in various shapes and forms, and therefore not protect the owners of that capital from that expropriation of that property. If that happens, investment will not come back into the country, and indeed we will actually see an outflow of capital from the country, because people simply do not keep their assets in a jurisdiction where those assets are not secure. And the more threat that there is that people's things will be taken away from them, the more likely they are to put it out of the reach of those who threaten to take them. This is a risk at the current point in time, but it's certainly not a certainty, and this is one area where great certainty needs to be provided. Should we see a hard commitment to the protection of property rights, as is enshrined in our Constitution, then I think that this risk can be relatively easily removed. But that commitment to property rights is absolutely critical if we want to attract investment back into the country. The third consideration here is that a swathe of new policies have been proposed and mooted over the last few years, many of which make it difficult for business owners to make good decisions around their business. And in difficult times like COVID especially, businesses need to be able to be dynamic and not be at the mercy of far-flung policymakers who feel that they should have a say with regards to how a business operates and how that business continues to keep its doors open through making the minimum profit requirements. This interference in businesses' ability to make decisions will continue to deter investments for an extended period of time. And until that has been removed from the business landscape in the country, it's very unlikely that we will see any material investment recovery. The last 2 points here are macro instability and political uncertainty. And historically, these have actually always been Namibia's strong points. The fact that we've been, from a macroeconomic perspective, quite stable, and from a political perspective, very stable. However, instability and uncertainty are definitely increasing across these two factors. Our fiscal situation is very worrying, and the amount of money that government now has to pay back, service, or roll forward over the next few years certainly raises some question marks about long-term macro stability. While the shock that we'll see on the current account as a result of these lower than expected soccer receipts the next 2 years definitely raises question marks around the long-term sustainability of the currency peg. This is not to say that something will happen soon or will happen at all, but it certainly means that the risk profile has changed. This is something that I put on Twitter a few days ago, and I've actually been trying to avoid Twitter a bit because it tends to get me into trouble. But I think that this is quite an important point when it comes to how do we get out of the situation that we now find ourselves in. If Namibia wants to be more competitive for investment, job creation, and government revenue growth, it needs fewer rules or current rules to be materially more efficiently implemented. The former requires a swipe of a pen. The latter requires a complete change of administrative culture. This can be summarized in the following 3 points. A lot of rules, where those rules are efficiently implemented, is bearable for business. Few rules, where these rules are inefficiently implemented, can be bearable for business. But the environment that we have here, where there are a lot of rules, but they're very inefficiently implemented, and one waits many months often for very simple decisions to be made on administrative processes, this is an absolute business killer. And much like this little graphical representation of tax, the same is very true when it comes to rules and compliance for small businesses. Large institutions that can employ large numbers of compliance people, that can wait for many months to get certificates, or can send people into offices, organizations, and so on to ensure that they get the certificates that they need, can withstand this environment much more than small businesses. But small businesses are the critical employers in the country. The 10 large businesses in the country do not employ anywhere near as many people as all the small businesses in the country do. And these small businesses are the ones that really bear the brunt of this excessively regulated environment. As well as that, this excessively regulated environment that kills small companies makes it very difficult for small companies to grow up into big companies. It's like killing a sapling before it becomes a tree. And that, I think, is a very, very important point for Namibia. If we want to see more Namibian businesses, if we want to see more young Namibians being job creators and creating opportunities and growth for the country, contributing to the fiscus and similar, we need to have an environment that nurtures those institutions, not one that puts so many roadblocks and regulations in their way. And very much the same applies with regards to tax. We have a very one-dimensional tax system for corporates, and it doesn't matter whether you're a big business or a small business, you're subject to very much the same tax regime. This makes it very difficult for small businesses that have to pay away big percentages of their profits, when often the owners of those businesses are taking nothing or next to nothing out of the business and reinvesting everything. The third shareholder, being the government, demands its share of cash, even when the business may not be sitting with that cash. And cash flow is absolutely everything when it comes to small businesses and their ability to survive. And if we want to see a change in investment, we're not talking exclusively about foreign investors with pointy shoes and briefcases full of cash. We're also talking about small Namibian investors trying to eke out business opportunities for themselves, grow businesses, and become an important part of the Namibian economy and ecosystem. So moving forward to our conclusions, from the speech, we see a number of positives, but also quite a few negatives. On the positive side, the vaccine rollout being expected is obviously very positive, and we're very glad to hear that Namibians are not going to be forced, or that government is not going to try to force Namibians to take vaccines or to take specific vaccines. Not because we have any particular problem with any of these, but from a principle perspective, we believe that this should be the decision of individuals. A major positive, and something that we've been pushing for a long time, is the Development Bank of Namibia's micro, small, and medium enterprise loan scheme that is being well funded by government now and hopefully rolled out relatively efficiently over the next few years. This really matters. A lot of Namibians don't have friends, families, and the conventional third-party fools on who they can lean in order to get capital to start businesses. This has its roots in history, but it's very important that we don't let it play a huge role in the future. And as a result of that, we need vehicles like this that provide capital to young entrepreneurs, Namibians who have business ideas, but don't have the capital within their networks to be able to execute those business ideas. So this is something that we feel very positive about. Another positive is that the Minister has repeatedly talked about the need for growth, as well as the need for structural reform in order to drive that growth. And we think that that is exactly right, and the Minister is absolutely spot on with regards to his diagnosis of the problem there. As well as that, the fact that there's no general tax increase is favorable. As mentioned, we have a small shrinking economy from which government is extracting quite large quantities of revenue already, and more tax at this point in time we think will be positively counterproductive. So we think that that's a good move. As well as that, the introduction on the timeline now on the NAMRA, the new revenue agency, is very positive, and we think that where more revenue can be extracted from the economy, it will likely be through better tax administration and ensuring more equitable, more fair administration of tax and getting those who are non-compliant to be compliant, rather than increasing tax rates on the already compliant. The zero VAT rating on sanitary products is obviously very positive. This is something that should have been done a very long time ago, and we think that the Minister and all those that lobbied for this must be congratulated. Talk of SOE reform, also very positive. The fact that there's an expectation that MTC will be listed, I think sets a good precedent, and this is something that will hopefully open up some consideration of what can be done with some of the other SOEs. We are a little bit cautious, however, when it comes to the Air Namibia situation of being too congratulatory. The reason that we say this is that we don't think that there was really a lot of people that wanted to close down Air Namibia, despite it being an inefficient use of a very finite pool of public funds. As a result, we think hands were forced more than anything, and that is concerning because we think that lessons should be learned from the Air Namibia saga. Rather than waiting until hands are forced, we should look at what can be done in some of our less well-performing state-owned enterprises and look at how we can make those changes before there are very few options left to us. But nevertheless, we think that the end result, at least, has been good in that instance. VAT processing is another positive. The fact that in previous speeches the Minister talked about speeding up the VAT repayment and processing periods, and that is something that desperately needed to be done, but I believe that Gerda will talk more about it after this. So I won't go into too much detail. And then the final positive that we pulled out of the speech that we think is worth noting here is the fact that there has been a reduction in defense spending, something we've been advocating for many years, 800 million reduction, but defense will still be receiving more than 5 billion, which is a huge waste of public resources, especially when those resources are so finite. On the negative side, however, despite the importance of growth and despite the drive needed for growth, very little has been said on how growth will be attained. And rather than providing details, a heavy reliance has been placed on Harambee 2 and the Economic Recovery Plan for growth. The concern around this is that the drafts of both of these are relatively weak, and they don't look at how the might of private sector can be truly unlocked to drive growth recovery. Instead of that, we have very government-centric plans with a lot of the problems of old still present. And we think that because of that, these plans are unlikely to unlock the growth that the country so badly needs to get out of what is becoming a very sticky situation. We've discussed SACU, and that is a major negative, but I won't go into it once again. We've also discussed the funding requirement. One big negative that we have not discussed is the fact that our first hard currency debt comes due in the current year, and that is the first Eurobond, material hard currency debt. We have had smaller maturities in the past. What we are very concerned about is that the plan for this Eurobond now appears to be letting it redeem in hard currency and issuing local currency debt in its place. We can completely understand why this is appealing. Not having a big stock of hard currency debt is definitely preferable in many ways to having this obligation to foreign financiers. However, because of the quantum of the deficit and the borrowing requirement domestically, there's already a huge burden going to be placed on local pension funds, particularly, to provide local funding to government. Adding the maturity of this instrument and trying to issue domestic debt in addition to this huge budget deficit, we think will basically require that the pension savers of the country will have to contribute a materially larger portion of their savings to government. And we think that this may actually cause some form of liquidity event in the country if we're not extremely careful. The debt servicing of over 16% of revenue this year and 17% of revenue next year is a huge concern. And this is something that we really need to take seriously going forward. Debt being the single largest source of funding is equally concerning and continues to put us on this road towards a debt trap if we are not extremely careful. And the window of opportunity to avoid that debt trap is closing relatively quickly. As well as this, the dividend tax, as discussed previously, without clarity on the reduction in corporate tax, is something that is, at this point, not a red flag, but certainly an orange flag. And we urge the Minister to consider a material reduction in corporate tax with a higher dividend tax to create an incentive for businesses to keep money in their business without prejudicing the return that investors can get should they wish to take some funds out. NIEF and NEPA are mentioned as solutions to the growth problem, but in our view, saying that we will implement NIEF and NEPA in order to drive growth is like saying we'll hold your head underwater to stop you from drowning. This is simply not possible. This is anti-investment policy, and while we can understand why these pieces of policy are being muted, we believe that the results that they produce will be positively counterproductive by driving investment out of the country rather than attracting the investment into the country that we so badly need. Without that investment, the socioeconomic outcomes will also likely deteriorate. And as a result of that, we may expect to see these policies driving the complete opposite of what they're trying to achieve with regards to reduced inequality and reduced poverty. As well as that, there's some talk of picking winners in this budget speech. We do not like the idea of picking winners. There is no good reason to give some sectors a leg up when you could give the whole economy better opportunities through less regulation, less red tape, and similar. Rather than trying to give special opportunities to big foreign investors into very specific spaces, we need to make it easier for Namibians and Namibian businesses to invest into the economy wherever they happen to be investing. And there's no need for large delegations to go overseas to seek investment and present investment opportunities and special treatment to those foreign investors while we have entities and individuals in the country that would be better placed to make many investments were there a more friendly business climate in general, not in those specific areas. And as well as that, I think the final point that we want to make is that there is very limited meaningful expenditure reform within this budget. And we think that that matters at the current point in time. Because government is spending 68 billion, because we have financial constraints in the country as a whole and in the fiscus specifically, and because there's a huge number of fiscal needs, we need to make sure, or demands on the fiscus, we need to make sure that that 68 billion worth of expenditure is spent on all the right things. And we must make sure that it is applied as efficiently and effectively as possible to drive growth and socioeconomic development in the country. And we think that there's still a lot of scope for improvement when it comes to that. And I'll leave it at that and hand over to Gerda, who will take you through the tax side of things. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Roland. My task today is to go through the budget tax amendments that the Minister announced yesterday in his second tabling of the Namibian budget. The Minister said that no tax rate changes will be made. We will discuss the other comments he made around the non-mining tax rate. The disappointing thing is that the individual tax rates have not changed, and they haven't changed since 2013, which means that there's a lot of inflation creep into the brackets. We believe that the lowest bracket should be around 70,000 already, instead of the 50,000 that we currently have. And we know that the Minister doesn't have a lot of moving in his budget, but we do believe that that is something that needs to get attention. On the non-mining corporate tax rate, the Minister did say that they will consider a reduction of the rate. He didn't indicate by how much the rate will reduce. As you all know, it's at 32% at the moment. He also did indicate that the timing of when they will look at this again, or when they will make an announcement around it again, is with the mid-year budget review, which is in October 2021. So my belief here is that we need to stay competitive, and especially if you, under the current circumstances, and especially if you look at just the countries around us. Botswana, for example, has a non-mining corporate tax rate of between 22% and 30%. South Africa is at 28% and will reduce to 27% in 2022. Zambia is between 15 and 40%, and the 40 is for the mining companies. And Zimbabwe is between 15 and 24%. So as you can see, we're not competitive when it comes to the non-mining corporate tax rate, and then we not even talk about mining rates and diamond mining rates. So we will have to watch the space here to see by how much the Minister will reduce the non-mining corporate tax rate. Also, if we talk about the introduction of the local dividend tax that we will discuss later, there is a sense that it needs to be in sync with the change of the non-mining corporate tax rate to incentivize companies to keep investing in Namibia. On the NAMRA side, the Minister confirmed that the commencement date of NAMRA is now the 7th of April. I do expect collections and efficiencies over time. I don't think it will happen immediately, but we do expect collections and efficiencies to come in over time. The Minister didn't make any mention of ITAS in his budget speech, and I will make some comments around ITAS a bit later. On the VAT side, the Minister announced introduction of the 0% on sanitary pads. I think it might just be a misspoke or a typo when he talks about pads only. I hope it is for all sanitary products. The Minister also urged suppliers and retailers to pass the relief on to their customers. And again, we don't know when this amendment will come in. There will have to be an amendment to the VAT Act, but we don't know when that will happen. We also hope that there will be some indication around transitional measures. We find this in the past when, you might remember, we had a 30% rate on luxury items, and when that moved to 15%, there was quite a bit of issues around system changes and enough time for retailers to adjust the systems. So we hope there will be transitional measures in the amendment as well. The other VAT amendment that was introduced or was talked about again was mentioned in 2018 already, and that is around the income of listed fund managers. So the Minister announced an introduction of 15% on the income of listed fund managers, and that is to bring them on par with unlisted fund managers. So currently unlisted fund managers need to charge 15% VAT on their income, while listed fund managers do not. And that is because of a specific technical definition in the VAT Act. Now, it's interesting that the ministry decided to bring the listed fund managers on par with the unlisted fund managers and not the other way around. And the reason why I think that's interesting is because I do believe it will make investment cost higher, especially for the individual, because they will now have a 15% VAT that they pay on the fees, while they cannot claim it back. Corporate investors, obviously a different story for most of them. But yeah, the private sector will have increased costs there. Again, no indication around the timing. The Minister did make a general comment around all the amendments that will come in 2022, 2023, but he didn't mention specific timing around any of these amendments. On the withholding tax side, the Minister announced that the taxpayers will need to prove that they withheld tax from services. And I'm a bit uncertain as to what the concern here is. Is it around gross up? Is it around compliance? Or is it the concern that was raised some time ago where the Minister wanted taxpayers to prove that they withheld the tax and able to deduct the expense? So we're not 100% sure what the idea is with the amendment and what it would look like, obviously. And then again, around the timing, there wasn't any specifics in the budget speech. Then a completely new one is the Minister said that he will review the withholding tax on interest that's been withheld from by unit trust when payments are made to non-Namibian companies. This is, as I say, this is a new announcement. We haven't seen this in previous proposals or previous budget speech. And no further details were given in the speech or in the other budget documents. So we will have to see what the details are around this and, again, the timing of the amendment. We also do hope that there will be some stakeholder discussions once there's a proposal on the table. On the withholding tax on dividend side, as you all know, this one was first announced in 2018, and there's even a draft amendment bill in terms of which there was a lot of conversations and several submissions to the Ministry of Finance around concerns with the implementation of the withholding tax. And that was around the tax on double levels as you go into your company structure, some issues around the definition of a dividend that seems to include, for example, the repayment of loans. And all of these concerns were raised with the ministry some time ago. The Minister did say yesterday that there will only be a dividend tax on once, so there won't be a multiple withholding tax as you go up the structure. But he didn't mention anything around the other concerns that we raised some time ago. So we will have to see what the new proposal will look like, and hopefully all the concerns that we raised previously will be addressed. Again, there wasn't anything around the timing. And like we said earlier, we hope that the withholding tax on dividends, the 10% that will come in, are being cushioned by a change in the corporate tax rate. The Minister then also mentioned Vrytax. Now, Vrytax is an interesting one. It's a provision that's been in the legislation since the legislation was implemented a number of years ago. And basically what it is your non-resident owners of ships or aircraft that embark goods or passengers in Namibia needs to pay tax. So they need to take 10% of their income and declare that as their taxable income, and then the corporate tax rate applied to that amount. Unfortunately, it hasn't been enforced, as far as I understand, since the implementation of the Income Tax Act. And the reason for that is there's a lot of practicalities that are in issue here, and because it's a non-resident that needs to make the payment. So there's lots of issues around how do they make the payment, do they need to register, how do they register? And again, the Minister did say that they are looking at this and to strengthen the enforcement of that provision, but he didn't give any details. So we will have to see how they solve this problem. As I said earlier, this provision has been in the legislation for some time, and one wonders how much income or revenue we could have collected from this if it was enforced from the beginning. Then a very welcomed one that the Minister also mentioned in his previous budget speech is the deduction of your annual contributions to pension funds, provident funds, retirement annuity funds, and study policies. As you know, at this point, the annual deduction is 40,000 Namibian dollars. That will increase to 150,000. There was no indication around timing, but we do hope that it will still be implemented for the current tax year, for the 2022 tax year. Unfortunately, as we know, legislation takes a while to be promulgated and to become effective. And there's not a very good track record that these things go very quickly. So my fear is that it will only be applicable from the 2023 tax year. But let's see and watch the space, so to speak. On the environmental taxes and fuel levy side, there were no changes announced. The last changes was, I think, in June 2020, but no further changes were announced. On the sin tax side, as you probably all heard, the normal increases, we've seen the normal increases, and all of these are applicable from the 24th of February already. So, for example, a can of beer or cider will increase with 14 cents. A bottle of 750 milliliters of spirits will increase to $5.50. And then around your tobacco and cigars and cigarettes, there are also some increases. These are your normal increases for excise duties. We call it sin taxes, but it's an excise duty that are payable to customs and excise and that form part of the SACU pool. Then, as you probably all know by now, the manufacturing incentives and the export processing zone incentives have been abolished. That legislation came through on the 31st of December 2020. And the reason for the amendments, or part of the reason for these amendments, were that Namibia was blacklisted by the EU. We have since been removed from that blacklist in February because of the changes we made to the legislation. I've said that before, and I keep saying that I do believe that it was not necessary for these incentives to be abolished completely. They could have been toned down a bit, but it wasn't necessary to completely remove them. And I know my manufacturing clients will give me the eye now, but I do believe some of them have been quite generous, like, for example, the export allowance. So what will happen with these is your additional salary and training allowance, your marketing allowance, your transport allowance, as well as your tax rate will still be available for one tax year. And I'm paraphrasing from the law, excuse me, I'm paraphrasing from the law because it's not 100% clear. Well, but we do believe the intention was that it refers to one tax year. The current wording just refers to a year, but we do believe it means a tax year. So there will still be, these allowances will still be available for one tax year after the 31st of December 2020. And then the export allowance, which is not directly connected to a registered manufacturer, you just need to have manufactured goods that you export. That one will only be abolished 5 years. And again, we paraphrase 5 tax years from December 2020. So you can see it's almost like a phased-out approach of these provisions. The minister then again reiterated that this will be replaced by incentives in terms of the Special Economic Zone policy framework. Now, I don't know if we just don't know what will be in the framework, but as far as I know, this framework has not been finalized yet. So it is a bit worrying that we already have all our manufacturing allowances and EPZ allowances or incentives abolished before we've seen the actual framework for the Special Economic Zone. And as I mentioned earlier, legislation takes a while to go through, so we fear there will be some time where there are no manufacturing incentives in Namibia. Again, that makes us, in my view, less competitive with the region, because we see some of these and different type of incentives around us in other countries. The minister then also didn't mention any of the other 2018 proposals, and we're actually not sure if these are still being discussed, if they are still on the table, so to speak. And some of them I will just mention to remind everybody of what was on the table some time ago. So the first one is your residency and hybrid system of tax, taxation of trusts, taxation of commercial activities of churches, and charitable institutions. Then the withholding tax allowances that are currently 3 years, there was talk to increase it to 5 years. And then also the non-deductibility of royalties payable by non-diamond mining companies. The amendment that was talked about some time ago around the VAT and transfer duty on property transactions. So where you sell shares or membership interest in a company or a CC that owns immovable property. So we don't know what's going to happen with that proposal, that VAT and or transfer duty should be applicable. And then, of course, capital gains tax that are talked about every now and then. On the tax incentive program, the minister did mention that in his speech, and that new program started in February 2021, so earlier this year. And basically what it says is that if you pay your outstanding tax by April 2021, all your penalties will be remitted and 95% of your interest will be written off. If you pay your outstanding tax after April but before February 2022, all your penalties will be remitted, but only 75% of the interest will be written off. So this is quite a generous tax incentive program, and I know that the ministry collected quite a lot of revenue with the previous program, so I think the minister is hopeful that this one will also bring in a lot of revenue and obviously clean up some of the outstanding issues on the system. What is very interesting is this time around you can register yourself for the program on ITAS. But what I would like to say is that you need to be careful how you register. You can register, but how you make your payment. Because if you make a tax payment, that payment goes off against tax and penalties first, and then you will still have an interest outstanding. So what we suggest is that you register, make your tax payment, and then go back and see what the system says you then need to still pay in interest. And the Ministry of Finance is also recommending that. So yes, I must say we've used it already, and it's working quite smoothly. So I would suggest that if you have outstanding tax or you're not sure, have a look on your profile and use the program. Then from a VAT refund side, as you know, the minister announced, excuse me, the minister announced a re-engineering of the VAT refund process late last year. And in his view, the changes are progressing well. I'm not sure we see that in practice because we still find refunds taking longer than 90 days to be paid out. And the problem here is that they still need to do an audit, and if there's audit, only after the audit queries are finalized will the 90 days kick in. Now, in my view, the law, that's not what the law says. The law says the refund needs to be paid out 60 days after the commissioner is satisfied. And we had a recent recent court case where a Namibian court was saying that 60 days was specifically put into the legislation for the minister to satisfy himself. So the 60 days are a fair amount of time for the commissioner to satisfy himself and to make the refund. So I think we might see some more challenges around the VAT refund process. And it has been the issue from the start where the delays come in with the audits. So I believe there needs to be a rethink of the VAT refund process, and that the ministry possibly go back to or go to a risk-based audit process and rather audit those taxpayers that they really think are at risk. They can always go back and always audit again after the refund has been paid out. And there are a number of penalties and interest provisions that the ministry could use if people are claiming things they shouldn't claim or if there were mistakes made. So again, although the ministry thinks the re-engineering process is going well, I don't think we're feeling it in practice yet. Then from an ITAS perspective, I've said many times I like the system. I actually go as far as saying that I love the system because we don't have any papers in our office anymore, or almost nothing. And it is really a convenient system because at any point in time you can go into your client's profile and have a look at the status. provide feedback, try and sort out issues. I think the issue with Etx is that there wasn't enough education around the system. I have to be honest, it's not an intuitive system. So for us that work a lot with it, it's easy to work on it. You can find ways of getting the best statement out of the system and all that. But I don't think it's easy for someone that goes into the system every now and then when they submit a return. So I do think education and maybe some training was needed, and we certainly provide that to clients. And then I also think there's some issues around the migration of the information from Tax Live or from returns that have been submitted but not processed on the old Tax Live system to Etx. And that's where we find still a lot of returns and a lot of payments that are not processed or assessed. And I think the combination of those two things makes it daunting to work with Etx. But I really encourage you to have a look at the system, and we can assist with training if you really need that. And then the other problem at this stage that we're all battling with is the Etx Uploads. So basically those are your pay-as-you-earn information that needs to be uploaded on the system for individuals to do their tax returns. That the upload is very sensitive, and any small thing can actually prevent it from being uploaded or send the wrong information to the individual's tax return. So that one is quite challenging, and we keep discussing different ways of doing this with the Ministry of Finance. And that's my story. I actually thought I had more to say, but that's my story. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome my panelists. Thank you for the insightful yet scary overview and presentations and highlighting some of the important concerns. We will be taking answers, question sessions right now. For the people who have joined us via the virtual link, I'm not sure if that is still working, but if you can see us and you've joined us in the presentation, please do drop any questions in the comment section, and we will attend to it right after the presentations, trying to answer those questions. For the people in the room, we're looking to take about 4 to 5 questions. So if you have any interesting and challenging questions for our panelists, kindly just raise your hand and the mic will be circulated to you. Any questions? At least one question. The young gentleman at the back, Robert.
Thanks. Just a question directed to Roland. So we know that there's a significant funding requirement, and government will try to get a lot of that from the domestic market, it seems. We have also seen that government is still planning on this IMF funding, and that's been mentioned last year. We haven't seen many updates around that, and it's in the region of 4 to 4.5 billion. What are your views on the likelihood of this funding, and what is the impact if we don't get that funding?
Robert, asking your supervisor questions in an audience like this is is a bit of a career-limiting move. I think we are concerned about the IMF funding, and we believe that there's some reluctance to go to the IMF. The IMF of old, of 1980s, did itself no favors in terms of how it engaged with emerging countries that hadn't managed their fiscal situations very well. And so governments in many emerging market economies are quite cautious about going to the IMF. And so I think that there is a possibility that that there will be reluctance to sort of finalize that process, for one. And for two, I think that there's a risk that the IMF may not wish to fund the country under the facility that we previously thought that they may, because they will look at this budget and be quite concerned about it. And so the implication of that is that there may be less foreign money coming in over the next year or two. At the moment, the expectation is that the net will be zero. So we'll redeem a hard currency instrument, the first Eurobond, and then at the same time we will get money from the African Development Bank and the IMF. If the latter doesn't happen, then it will definitely present an additional funding challenge, and Malcolm will probably be called upon to provide some. So the pension fund industry will likely be called upon to provide some additional funding. So there, yeah, a few doors will be knocked on, I suspect, to try to get local funding to support that. But obviously, as discussed already, there's quite a substantial concern around our ability to fund the deficit domestically as it currently stands. It's interesting to just contrast the situation that we have now to 2016, because it was actually a very similar situation in 2016 where we struggled to fund the budget deficit from domestic sources. We didn't have much in the way of cash balances, and this drove government to running into large arrears with creditors. And that caused the whole economy to sort of slow because government sort of sits at the crossroads of capital movement in the country. So if there's a liquidity challenge in government, then it can cause quite a material sort of slowdown in economic activity. And we think that there is a risk of that going forward, and particularly a risk of that should the pension funds push back against pension fund regulation changes. And we think that there's a very high probability of that.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Are there any more questions?
Revenge is sweet. So you've brought up like the debt trap. Can you maybe take us through that scenario? What does that actually look like? And don't you think the fact that they've swapped out hard currency debt for local debt makes the risk of a debt crisis? Like generally a debt crisis is most often as a result of a foreign debt obligation that cannot be met. So don't you think that it lowers that risk potentially? And then also in the longer run, that we won't necessarily have a massive default on the debt necessarily, because we will have other mechanisms. For instance, the currency peg will go, inflation will spike, and can you take us through that scenario?
You guys are suckers for punishment this morning. Did I not depress you enough, Malcolm? Okay, these are all linked together, right? So the three things that you've asked as separate questions, I think I'll rather try to cover as one in a bit of a story. The debt trap situation is a situation where an ever larger portion of revenue is being allocated to debt servicing. And that basically gets you into a situation where you need to kind of restructure your debt obligations, or you can't provide the goods and services that you need to provide to the public for the taxes that they pay. And that, in all likelihood, results in political realignment. So that's the first kind of consideration there. When it comes to having more debt in local currency than in hard currency, that's certainly beneficial generally, because it means that you're less likely to have a hard default. But there are very few hard defaults that happen nowadays. So most of the time it's debt restructuring of some sort, or some kind of money printing that causes the problem to be kicked down the road, and then inflation to take care of it in some way, shape or form. The challenge in the Namibian instance is the currency peg, because the ratio that we have to so closely monitor is hard currency to currency in circulation, or physical currency to currency in circulation, hard currency to currency in circulation, so physical cash in circulation. The implication of that is that the extent to which we could roll on the printing press is very limited. And if you consider that maturity profile that we have over the next few years, I mean, our total hard currency debt is 30 billion. We expect it to decline quite a bit over the next few years, even though we will be pulling more pension fund money back into the country, which will register as an inflow, and a addition to the hard currency reserve position. But the implication, the ultimate implication of it is that we can still, probably print enough to cover, 1 or 2 years of maturity. But after that, we would be very much at the end of the road. And at that point, you would have a currency decoupling or currency recoupling at a different ratio type of event. Were that to happen, then you would have the next step would be that you would have a weaker exchange rate, Namibia, you can calculate that quite easily. If you have a net outflow on your balance of payments, it basically means that demand for local currency by foreigners is less than demand for foreign currency by locals, which means that you should have depreciation in your currency. So you'd have depreciation in the currency because we import everything that we consume just about. That would mean that most of the goods and services in the country would become more expensive, which is de facto inflation. That's good if you're sitting on a big net liability position. It's less good if you've been saving, your whole life to cover your pension, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a very real risk. So I mean, strategically, if you want to align yourself to government's kind of debt or net liability position, and you should be fine in a decoupling event. But for people that have done the responsible thing their whole life and saved towards a pension, you may see an erosion of that value in real terms. But no, I think the chances of a hard currency or a hard default is very low. I don't see that happening over the near term. I think that the real risk is a currency peg event. And that currency peg event, inflation washes away many sins. And I think that it would do exactly that for the fiscal position. And to be very blunt, I think that if you see a change if there is a political realignment, which we think is becoming increasingly likely, if there is political realignment, I would not be at all surprised if that goes with a currency repegging event or a currency decoupling event, because that would set your new leadership up with a lesser real debt position. The restructuring would be blamed on the outgoing individuals, and there would be a sort of relatively fresh start. But it would result in a materially worse situation for many Namibians. Your more wealthy individuals would in all likelihood increase their incomes in line with inflation, but your less skilled individuals would be left behind. I think it wasn't with your organization, but I once said to one of the organizations in Cape Town that I would craft a piece for them called The Road to the IMF. And they said, don't do that for a number of reasons. But the timelines are tricky because there are still levers that can be pulled. So how aggressively are we going to pull the Regulation 28 or Regulation 13 lever over the next few years? If we go from 45 now to 55 now, which we think is quite likely, and then to 65 next year, and then 75 thereafter, then that road becomes quite short. What happens with regards, the single biggest macroeconomic risk around NIAF is that it will cause investment to flow out of the country. That's the single biggest macro risk. Growth is growth. It's not, it's a sort of statistical thing, whatever. It doesn't really matter. There's not a specific tipping point on growth per se. There may be some kind of tipping point on employment, but it will feed through into politics and things like that. But the real tipping point is on the reserve position and the currency peg. And the big macro risk on NIAF is it causes investment to flow out of the country. If investment flows out of the country at the same time that you have a big SACU deficit, you have imports recovering in the post-COVID environment. You have relatively weak exports because of rand strength, et cetera, et cetera. In that environment, if you have FDI outflows as well, then you're going to have to pull the pension fund regulation lever faster for the current account than you are for the fiscal deficit. And so then you can find yourself, using pension fund money for these two objectives, which are completely contrary to the objectives of the savers. And so I think that it depends on a lot of different things. Worst case scenario, it can happen extremely quickly. In the worst case scenario, I think within 2 years, you can have a currency decoupling event. But the can be kicked down the road for a decade or more. And if we do see material reform, the nice thing about the reform as well is that it's not really reform that, the required reform is not really reform that takes a lot of doing by government. It actually takes a lot less doing by government, a kind of get out the way reform, rather than build these bridges and this thing and this complex infrastructure and this hydrogen thing and so on. So it's a get out the way reform that's needed. So that's actually not that complicated reform to implement. And if we get material reform of that nature, then I think you can see quite a big change in economic activity that can cause what is currently a major red flag to transition through orange to green.
Thank you, Roland. There's another question.
Thanks. Okay, Roland, I fully agree with everything you just said. Who is having that conversation to get us to that point of reform? Because we have this discussion every year.
Does anyone have any questions for Gerda? No. So, Tian, I thought you were. So I think that the challenge is not so much who's having that who's having that conversation and who's making those points. It's the fact that it seems to be falling on somewhat or largely deaf ears. So I think speaking about this after the minister's speech may give the impression that it's falling on deaf ears to the minister. I don't think that's the case. I think that there's a small group of economic ministers that are fully aware of what needs to be done, but they are hamstrung by the political process, the collective decision-making setup, et cetera, and I think that that is the big impediment to reform. If you look at the difference between the minister's speech and these NIEF discussions that have been going on the last few days, and they're the polar opposite of the ideological spectrum. And what you see in the NIEF discussions is that this is happening whether you like it or not. And it's peculiar. It's like finalizing NIEF, which is like pushing businesses underwater, will make the business environment better. So, well, it's just it's pushing someone underwater to stop them drowning. It makes no sense. And I think that this sort of idea that we can have a pro-NIEF or NIEF pro-growth environment is just completely counterintuitive. It's completely impossible. It's absurd. And I think that message isn't currently being absorbed, and I think that there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that I think that there's a sort of ideological disconnect. That's certainly one of the problems. Another one is I think that there's just a lack of macro understanding from a lot of the people pushing these ideas. There's a NIEF scorecard that's floating around now. I mean, it's absurd. The additional compliance costs that will add for small businesses and similars, it means that many of these small businesses that are struggling already will simply close their doors. And rather than getting the empowerment and upliftment and so on that our society so desperately needs, you'll get the polar opposite. You'll have fewer people employed, higher levels of inequality, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think that the other point is that there's a disconnect in terms of the fact that there seems to be a view that being anti-NIEF is anti-socioeconomic development or anti-empowerment or whatever, however you want to encapsulate that. There's virtually no society in the world that doesn't want to see improvement in the lives of its people and doesn't want to, or that is innocuous to the fact that we need to bring everybody with you as you grow and as you develop. There's virtually no society in the world that doesn't have that as its socioeconomic development objectives. And Namibia is no exception. And I think there are very few people in Namibia that are an exception. Most of us fully believe that we need to grow the economy, but we can't do that in a manner that leaves a lot of people behind. So the question is not around that. The question is, how do we achieve that? And to say that, well, this piece of legislation is the way and the only way, when any sort of person who understands the macroeconomy and understands incentives and disincentives can see that it will have the polar opposite effect, is just completely counterproductive. And then I think obviously there are some vested interests and some sinister intent as well. So it is an opportunity to grab shares in businesses that you haven't earned, that you haven't worked for, etc. And I think some people certainly see that opportunity and would like to take advantage of it. And you can understand why. If somebody has been excluded for large parts of their lives, they are likely to take opportunities like this when they present, and they are likely to lobby for those sorts of opportunities. But at the same time, I think the obligations of those elected to power, many of whom wrote the Constitution or involved in the Constitution and process that voted unanimously in the Constituent Assembly for the Constitution that we sat with. The obligation of those individuals is to say, no, we're not going to put your vested interests ahead of the Constitution, ahead of sound macroeconomic principles, financial and macroeconomic stability, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's not being done. So I don't think that the problem so much is the broadcaster. I think the problem is on the recipient side.
Thank you. Any more questions? where the
Yeah, maybe to make two comments first. First of all, excellent presentations, really, really insightful. And what I always like about when you get your presentation as you do now, it's very similar to when you have a one-on-one discussion with yourself. So then you know that is it's a consistent message. I was going to make a very similar point as Tian was saying. Like, I've been here now for 5-6 years. And I recognize a lot of things coming back, very similar things that we discussed. And I say that respectfully, like 4 years ago, 2 years ago, etc. It seems to come back in a different form. So to me, it seems to be the only real solution is indeed partnership. So how can we work that it doesn't become us versus them? How can you, the private sector versus government, or this ministry versus that ministry, or this ideology versus that ideology, because otherwise we never get there. So it's maybe more common than, I would be interested to hear your views on, do you feel like over the last few years we are improving, we're working closer together, or are you feeling like it's exactly the opposite? Because if it's the opposite, we have a bigger problem. And to me, like all of us here, in an ideal scenario, you would have 3-4 different ministries. I'm not suggesting, I don't know, all of you being present here, but different ministries here, different private sector, and make it's for all of us to solve. We either all sink or we all prosper. But most importantly, just interested in your views, like, okay, are you feeling we're going up? We're jointly trying to tackle this, or is it the opposite?
Seeing that Roland doesn't want to take the mic anymore. Dennis, yes. I think, from my perspective, I think we're a little bit further away from 4 years ago, for example, around communication and discussions with the different ministries. I fully agree that we need to be together. It doesn't help we go this association, that association, go on its own and go and push their own messages. I think we all need to have the same message. But I think the most important thing here is for us somehow, I don't have the answer to it, but to get government to understand we are on the same side of the table. We are at the same table, we stakeholders, and it's not that we want to push a different agenda from them. It's just the way we want to get there, we want them to hear us. So I really think that is the thing we need to do. How we practically work it out in a room where we're not even allowed to sit in a room anymore, that is the difficult part, I think. And to convince government that we're not here to counter everything they say. We actually all in the same, I don't want to use the word boat, but on the same side of things and want to push the same things.
Yeah, I think maybe to add to that. So I think that one of the things that needs to be well understood is the fact that private sector and government don't work the same. We talk about public sector and private sector as if they're, two sides of the same coin. They're not. And I think that that's extremely important. Private sector is not an organization with a leader that dictates down to private sector what they will be doing. Private sector responds to incentives and disincentives, and it's lots of individuals and lots of individual entities doing that collectively. Government is totally different. There you do have a leader who says, what we are going to do now as government is X, Y, and Z, or a series of leaders that communicate and then say that that's what we're going to be doing. So to think that one can dictate to and instruct private sector to behave in a certain way, as if it's the other side of the government or the public sector coin, I think is the first kind of critical mistake. And we need to understand that if you want to get private sector to do certain things that you think are important for society and so on, you need to create the right incentives and disincentives for that. And that's sort of issue number one. Issue number two is that as much as people may view it as something that's evil or similar, profit is very, very, very fundamental to private sector. I mean, I don't need to say that to this room. But there's a perception that profit is bad. Now, certain types of profit obviously are bad. If you make your profit while destroying, the environment, while exploiting labor, etc., then your profit may be one of the bad forms of profit. But profit in and of itself is very fundamental to an economy. And that pursuit of profit can have huge socioeconomic benefits. But it doesn't, and markets are not perfect solutions to all these socioeconomic problems. But they can contribute to those socioeconomic solutions. But they're not going to catch everything. Private sector can play a huge role in that space. And we can see exactly what happens when private sector starts withdrawing in terms of from the economy in terms of socioeconomic development. All those households that used to have incomes that no longer do because well-meaning people are putting together pathetic NEF scorecards. You know, these sorts of things cause this withdrawal and cause socioeconomic harm, not good. So the right private sector environment where there's an adequate degree of regulation to ensure that people are not making unethical, immoral, unreasonable profit, that's fine. But where you start trying to take political objectives and impose them on private sector, as if it's an organization that can dictate from the top down that this is what we'll be doing. That's where things start to fall apart. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last few years. Inequality is something that we as a society should be concerned about. But no micro enterprise is concerned about inequality per se. The same with regards to poverty, the same with regards to all these other things. This is not a micro level problem that can be solved at micro level. This is a macro level problem, and this is where we need to create the right incentives and disincentives to say, how do we solve these sorts of problems in long-term sustainable manners? And in reality, for both of those problems, it's via employment. And employment only happens if companies can be profitable, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the stuff is all obviously deeply interlinked. Take it one step further, though, and say, well, okay, if we are taking these political objectives and imposing them onto private sector and say private sector is not doing enough, when private sector is actually doing a huge amount to contribute to socioeconomic development through employment, through, you know, while pursuing profit, because if you don't make profit, you close your doors and send everyone home and you have socioeconomic regression. But if private sector is now required to do those things, for what are all these taxes being paid? We pay these for a number of different things. One of them is for public goods that we all make use of. But another one of them, specifically in a country like our own, is to ensure that those people that have been left behind in the past don't remain left behind in the future. That portion of the equation is not working. And I think that one of the things that you see is increasing reluctance to pay more tax, to do more socioeconomic good, you know, CSR work, these sorts of things. Because it's more difficult to make profit, because you feel like private sector is blamed for a lot of the problems, but actually is contributing enormously to the pie, a third of all your profits going to, before tax, going to government. And that portion of the equation isn't working well. So I mentioned government spending 68 billion this year. How much of that is ensuring that little kids grow up in houses with running water and access to electricity? Very little. How much of it is ensuring that kids have really world-class education and that they don't remain left behind a generation, you know, as another generation left behind? How much of it is going to building new hospitals and ensuring that we have good access to healthcare for the population as a whole? And on all of these very fundamental things to ensure that we see long-term reductions in inequality, long-term improvements with regards to socioeconomic development across the board, the shortcoming is not on private sector side. And I think that this is something that we have to be honest about. You can't go and level all of these responsibilities that are political objectives that don't fit at micro enterprise size or at individual enterprise size onto private sector as if it is this, you know, homogeneous body with a leader at the top. It just doesn't work. And until we see a change with regards to that attitude towards private sector from public sector and an improvement in capital allocation from public sector, I don't think that these problems are going to disappear. Take it to your second question of, are things improving or getting worse? I personally think, so I said tongue-in-cheek in our office a while ago, because we have a young office of people who like to put me on the spot and won't be with us for much longer. No, but we have sort of quite a lot of debates around these sorts of things in the office. And one day I walked into the office, and I think it may have actually been Amy, said to me, what would be the one thing that would make you think that things are changing for the better? What would be the sort of one indicator? And I, you know, probably come from a meeting with government or something. So I said a bit tongue-in-cheek, when effing government listens to me. And, or listens to us. I don't think it was quite as ego-driven as me. But anyway, I definitely have actually seen a change with regards to economic ministers. And I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we started really sort of sounding warning bells about the fact that we were seeing a sort of economic cliff ahead of us, and we wrote in 2015 how we saw all of this playing out. We didn't put timelines on it because that's tricky, but we talked about a reduction in government revenue, driving a reduction in the economy, ratings downgrades, calling on pension fund assets. We wrote about all of this back in 2015, but then we were on a very sort of upward trajectory at that point, and people were not very sort of willing to believe what we were saying. Subsequent to that, I think that there's become a broad realization across the business sector, across public sector and others, that we have serious problems. And I think that we're seeing from specifically those economic ministers far greater willingness to listen, to engage, to look at working with us on various different things. And we've actually been sort of quietly involved behind the scenes in lots of things over the past couple of years. And not the bad things, just the better one. But at the same time, it's very split, because there's another sort of camp where, I'm very person non grata in certain in certain institutions, government institutions, and there's another camp that really firmly believes that I'm apparently a neoliberalist and a capitalist, as if these are all terrible things, which I've never quite understood. But anyway, so there's another camp that really doesn't want this message to be the message that goes ahead. There's so we draw a matrix of these things, and there's a sort of inclusive growth camp, and there's a redistribution camp. And the redistribution camp is not a fan at all, and their engagement has become less and less extensive over the last few years.
Thank you, Roland. I think that was quite a mouthful. I think we'll end with done with questions. I'll just make my last closing remarks to wrap things up. If there's one thing the 2021 budget has done, is highlight the vulnerabilities in the Namibian economy. As a country, there has been no growth, value addition since 2016. Unemployment is climbing, especially among the youth. And most importantly, debt is growing. For a better word, obligations are growing. And while some may argue global countries have been growing debt too, they fail to recognize the differences in economies and economic policies. The difference between what is being collected and what is paid out is increasing at a rapid rate and reaching unsustainable levels, especially if we want to finance it through issuing debt. Winter is finally here for Namibia, and the gap has become increasingly narrow to bring the necessary reform we need. I end with a saying by Les Brown, not Roland Brown. If you do what is hard, your life will be easy. If you do what is easy, your life will be hard. Aligning economic incentives in the Namibian economy has never become more crucial than now. Thank you all for listening this morning, and everyone that joined us on the virtual link, despite the hiccups and glitches we experienced. Once again, a big thank you to everyone for making this event possible. I hope you all enjoy your evening. Thank you.